I'd like to thank everybody for coming to our event today. We're very excited about this. The title of today's event is New Strategies, Extractivist Corporations, Communities, and the State in a Post-COVID World. My name is Nate Edenhofer, and I'm a PhD student in the politics department here at UC Santa Cruz, and a member of the Extractivism and Society Research Cluster, also here at UC Santa Cruz, which put together today's discussion. The cluster was formed in 2019. We worked towards developing a critical cultural political economy perspective to study extractivism and socio-environmental conflicts in the Americas, to open new ways of grasping the importance of the sector for the political economy of contemporary Latin America. So a little bit about the theme of the event today. Over the last few decades, resistance to mining and other mega projects has grown in Latin America. And in response, extractive companies have developed increasingly complex strategies and discourses designed to sway public opinion to their side and influence government's decisions and state institutions. We can identify at least three deeply entangled families of strategies at play here. So first, there's meaning making by developing international and domestic discourses that support the legitimacy of extractive activities and multinational corporations to win the support of both the society and the state. Second, by integrating with and capturing state agencies to ensure extractive capital accumulation and replacing the state in some of its functions. And third, through the production of subjectivities by preventing, intervening, and managing local opposition to extraction in order to create receptive and supportive communities. These are deeply entangled in the sense that at a particular site of extraction, we may find networks of corporations, states, epistemic communities, and NGOs operating together to secure extraction. Evidence shows that the COVID-19 pandemic has become a springboard for such dynamics in Latin America. This panel will explore these strategies and their implications for social movements, affected communities, and resource governance in the Americas. Now, please allow me to introduce each of our panelists. Dr. Ana Zalik is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. Her research and publications appearing in numerous journals in conjunction with colleagues and community organizations, examines and critiques the political ecology and political economy of industrial extraction, with a focus on the merging of corporate security and social welfare interventions in strategic exporters. Informed by critiques of capitalism and persistent colonialism and imperialism, her current research centers on Canadian investment in the denationalization of the Mexican energy sector and financial risk in new extractive frontiers in the global oceans and seabed beyond national jurisdiction. Jen Moore is an associate fellow of the Global Economy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. For about 15 years, Jen Moore has been researching, writing, and collaborating closely with the struggles of mining affected communities and allied organizations in Latin America, Canada, and other parts of the world. From 2010 to 2018, she coordinated the Latin American program at Mining Watch Canada. She has published multiple reports on how extractive companies use the international sphere, including the International Court for the Settlement of Investment Disputes at the World Bank, to sue countries where mines are suspended or canceled. Dr. Maiah Jaskoski is an associate professor of political science at Northern Arizona University. She specializes in environmental and indigenous politics, military roles, and borders in Latin America. She is the author of Military Politics and Democracy in the Andes. Her upcoming book with Oxford University Press is titled The Politics of Extraction: Territorial Rights, Participatory Institutions, and Conflict in Latin America, which analyzes how communities in extractive zones organize through, around, and against local participatory institutions to challenge new mining and hydrocarbon development. She also publishes on security privatization through public militaries selling private security to multinational extractive companies. Fernando Leiva. Fernando Leiva is professor of Latin American and Latino studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is the author of The Left Hand of Capital, Neoliberalism and the Left in Chile, and Latin American Neostructuralism, The Contradictions of Post-Neoliberal Development. He has published articles on extractivism, Latin American development, political economy, labor and labor flexibility, social movements, and the left in numerous journals. He is co-coordinator of the Extractivism and Society Research Cluster at the University of Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, and a member of Claxo's working group on business elites, the state, and domination. I want to say thank you to all the panelists for being here. So thanks, everybody. So now we can go ahead and get to the discussion. So first, each panelist will have 7 minutes to explain these new company or state strategies based on their research expertise. We will do another 5-minute round following up on the implications of this. And at this point, members of the cluster will pose some questions to the speakers based on the conversation. The panelists should feel free in their responses to ask questions to other panelists also. And following this, we will take questions from the audience. If you have a question you would like to ask the panelists, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your question. Tomas Chieson Labelle will collect these questions to ask. So with that, we can go ahead and let's start with the first question for the panelists. So how have state and corporate strategies to entrench and expand extractivism in the Americas evolved over the last 2 decades? What has spurred these changes, and what are the defining traits of this new generation of strategies? And we will go ahead and start with Dr. Ana Zalik. And when you have 2 minutes left, I'll put up a little sign.
For the sake of interpretation, remember to speak at a reasonable pace. This applies to all the panelists. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So Ana Zalik.
Many thanks, Thomas, Nate, Fernando, and everyone from the UC Santa Cruz Extractivism Cluster for the invitation to take part and to learn from colleagues in these discussions. So I framed my comments a bit sort of historically. They're not really, they don't go back that long, but 2 decades. So thinking about back 20 years when I started research for my dissertation a few months prior to 9/11 on the privatization of development assistance as a mechanism for the extension of neoliberal policy and practice, and specifically for the management of conflict in highly controversial sites of extraction. And my interest at the time was much more on corporate philanthropy and less on the oil industry and extraction, but over various years, it shifted towards the firm itself. And what I learned in that initial research was that while I had initially wanted to study foundation philanthropic activities, so MacArthur and Ford Foundation, for instance, and their role as mediating, regulating bodies, various people that I could interviewed in my initial sort of forays into the field pointed out that the main actor was in fact the firm in terms of their role in extending funds, community assistance of different kinds. And so, the way I'm going to describe what I see as a bit of a trajectory of change is one that moves from sort of the micro to the macro scale, from subject formation, which Nate addressed in the points that you have all identified, to one that's more around reputation management. But I also recognize that in describing that trajectory, it also reflects my methodological shift from the intensive field work that I would have done 20 years ago to being more based at a university institution where I get to do less intensive field work. And so my, moving towards reputation management may be as much a reflection of my methodology as it is of corporate strategy. But in any case, I'll continue with that. So, in my initial research, I identified three clear sort of mechanisms via which large firms, and at this point, I was looking specifically at Shell in Nigeria and Pemex in Mexico, which have obviously extremely different attributes. One is a transnational firm, one is a parastatal, but which shared certain features as a result of the broader implementation of neoliberalism. The first of them was this movement from what was described as a community assistance model to a community development model, development being defined by the oil industry and specifically by Shell as capitalist entrepreneurship and self-help. And so, you know, when I initiated my research, for instance, at that time, I'm just going to share my screen if I can, yes. There was there was a particular pamphlet available. I'm just trying to show this as a pamphlet available at the Shell Center in London with this direct quote from Margaret Thatcher reading, "There is no alternative." Are you able to see this now? Hello?
Yes, we are.
Yep.
Okay, great. This direct quote from Margaret Thatcher, sort of representing the broader view, the kind of Washington consensus perspective that was being adopted in sustainable community development practice by the large transnational firms. But some years later, they moved this, they transitioned to a slightly different perspective, where they went from there is no alternative to there are no ideal answers, which was a reflection of the broader I guess you could say cracking of the hegemony of neoliberalism that was the result of the financial crises of the early 2000s and more explicitly 2008. And so capitalist entrepreneurship and the immediate restructuring of subjects at sites of extraction, in other words, dealing directly with stakeholders, local communities affected by human rights violations, by environmental disasters of different kinds, was moved basically from this local form to a more regional form. So the second model that I had identified at that time was something around conflict transformation, which basically was around the reconfiguration of territorial identity among community members from what had been the historical relationships with that territory to ones that were increasingly defined by the extractive project. So for instance, the attempt to rename municipal kind of governance structures to provide them the same name as the actual oil field. I won't go into too much detail. The third, because there's not enough time, but I'll discuss it a bit later in the subsequent questions. The third was the merging specifically of development and security policy that was seen in such mechanisms as the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and involved public-private partnerships of different kinds with both private security, locally contracted, local residents contracted at security, as well as state security agencies. And so, you know, as this was going on sort of at the local community level, at the site of extraction, reputation management was also, or has been managed at the transnational level at the scale of financial transactions, with increasing attention basically to shareholder value and to ensuring that the firm's activities do not negatively affect both share value and also their ability to access credit and to have access to debt financing for further extraction. And here reputation management is greatly affected by, you know, environmental social governance, ESG, to use the terminology of sort of activist investment, and of course also by much more radical activism at the community level. And here we see large firms like TransCanada Pipelines, now TC, renaming themselves as TC Energy to distance themselves from projects such as the Keystone XL pipeline, and to distance themselves also from Canada in the context of its negative reputation in Mexico. So later I'll talk more about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Jen Moore.
Thanks very much, Nate and Alejandro, Fernando, to all who have been part of organizing today's event. I'm also very pleased to be able to play a part in this conversation, which is going to be very interesting already listening to Anna. I'm also going to share my screen. And I'm going to focus on a strategy. It's interesting thinking about a 20-year time frame for these projects, and something that we've been looking at very closely with the Mining and Trade Project at the Institute for Policy Studies has been the use of investor-state dispute settlement, which is of course a mechanism available to transnational corporations through nearly 3,000 free trade and investment protection agreements that have impacted around the world over the course of multiple decades, and in Latin America since the signing of NAFTA and in Mexico in 1992. But really a strategy that was thought of even much longer before that, and just a nod to the very interesting work of Nicolas Perrone, who's been looking into how it was Shell and other oil companies and their bankers and lawyers who wanted to contain the efforts of governments in the post-World War II era that were going through these processes of decolonization in order to secure their interests over their natural resources. And so I think it's not unusual, or it helps to explain why today this tool continues to be used in such a neo-colonial fashion and is really a go-to for the extractive industry. And just looking at the numbers of private arbitration cases that are being brought against governments, especially in the global south. Before 2000, there was only 4 of these cases from the extractive sector. And since then we've seen over 200, and it really is the extractive sector that brings about a quarter of these cases by and large. And just to reinforce the neo-colonial nature of this, well, and coming from Canada, Canada is a country that gets sued a lot as well, but the bulk have been brought against countries in the global south, and Latin America being the region that has been most sued, and it's principally by companies that are domiciled in the global north, as we've recently found in the US, Canada, UK, Netherlands, and Australia. And I just want to touch a little bit first for those that maybe aren't so enmeshed in looking at what is investor-state dispute settlement. This is basically a tool that these companies have to enforce their interests over governments in the global south through this one-way private arbitration based in different locations around the world, the World Bank being one of them. UN also has a forum. And very stacked in companies' favor. The results tend to be in corporations' favor. And I just want to narrow in, given time, to look at the assessment that we did of cases, all of the mining cases that were brought against Latin American governments between 98 and 2019. There's been a couple dozen more since, but it's interesting to see how these suits are really being used not just to punish governments for decisions that they're making, but truly to punish and contain the hard-fought efforts of mining-affected people, indigenous peoples, and other communities who are fighting hard against the devastating effects of mining on their territories, on their lands. We're trying to prevent these from happening. Of all of the cases, we found that about over a third at their core have concerns from the communities about indigenous rights and their opposition. They're saying no to these projects. Over half have to do with the application or implementation of mining and environmental laws. And another third have to do more with nationalization or trying to reap greater rents from the mining industry. And it's interesting right now, most recently, we've been working most closely with communities where companies are bringing suits over constitutional court decisions. There are multiple cases right now against Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala for decisions that their courts have made to reaffirm the efforts of mining affected people to protect their right to consultation, to defend their right to a safe environment, and to defend themselves against further forced displacement from massive mining activities. And I think also related to the governance side of this, that even when cases are not being brought but are being threatened, how this can have a real capture effect on governments and the decisions they're making. And I think one of the most recent cases, and this will take me to my final comments, where I want to mention a few thoughts about the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, Mexico was one of the few countries that did not declare mining to immediately being an essential industry. And it had to be suspended for what ended up being 6 to 8 weeks, a short period of time in light of things. But the US corporate associations and the CAMIMEX, the Chamber of Mining here in Canada, that's in Mexico, that is made up of both Mexican, US, and Canadian firms, were quick to announce, to allude to the entering in force of the newly negotiated NAFTA, USMCA, or TMEC as it's known in Mexico, that was going into effect on July 1st, 2020. And I would not be surprised, we don't have evidence of it, but I wouldn't be surprised that a number of these companies behind the scenes were saying to the president, you know, if you hold us back any longer, we will bring a slew of suits against your government that will make such a decision untenable. And there are other examples, but I just want to close and just take a few seconds to refer to a project that we've been working on at IPS in a coalition with groups from US, Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America, called the Coalition Against the Mining Pandemic, and how the pandemic and this sort of immediate declaration of mining as essential, really reinforcing this kind of idea of the industry as inevitable, as necessary, despite the significant damage and harms that this causes to people's health and future generations, and how over the course of the last 2 years, in a multitude of ways, we've seen really deepening asymmetry of power struggle at the very local level, and governments and industry at the national level pushing for deregulation, new plans, and new incentives. Also using some of the discourse around the energy transition in order to further justify and reinforce their interests moving forward. And I'll close my comments there, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Maiah, you go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nate. And I want to thank the research cluster for the invitation and the opportunity. This is such an enjoyable panel. So thank you very much. So when I think about shifts in the roles or the relationships between companies and communities across the last couple decades, what I see really is a shift in the role of the state, and specifically the insertion of the state between companies and communities. Of course, there's still plenty of direct interaction between companies and communities, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A as well. But I do want to talk about how the role of the state has increased. And really, the state has become to increasingly serve as a buffer between companies and communities, serving to legitimize and really facilitate extraction. Some of it can be thought of as state capture, and some of it can be aligned interests, I think, between companies and the state. And I'll talk about how this plays out in 2 arenas, the classical security sector and arena, but also in terms of community relations more generally, and especially at the moment when new extraction is being planned and proposed to the state. And in each of these 2 areas, there's really an important international context that has encouraged the state to kind of become this intermediary player. So if we start in the classical security sector, and there's some overlap between my comments and Anna Zalik's comments as well. I really appreciated her presentation on this. But if we start in the classic security sector, and we think about the international environment, I mean, the key kind of period in my mind is the 1990s. There's this explosion of human rights scandals directly implicating companies such as Shell and its work in Nigeria. And multinationals and extractives respond immediately, well, pretty immediately by kind of trying to protect their reputation, especially when it comes to human rights. And what we see in Latin America is companies trying to avoid hiring private security companies because, again, to avoid this tight association with human rights abuses, and instead increasingly relying on subsidizing public security forces, paying and providing resources to police and military forces, and therefore directly capturing the security apparatus. They then provide security for the companies and their operations. And that was going on earlier before the 2000s, but it really increases starting in the 2000s. The idea being that if the abuses are committed by state forces, then the blame will fall at least partly on the state and not entirely on the private multinationals. In terms of other shifts and shifting more to community relations in general, and especially when new extraction is on the horizon, there are two other big international shifts that I think really matter for what's been going on in the last 20 years. The first shift is in the environmental sector. We have the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And starting in the 1990s, because of that summit, you have a lot of governments implementing more environmental regulations. And I think the most important piece, especially concerning community relations between companies and communities, is the environmental licensing process and this official state-led environmental licensing process, which involves informing communities about new extraction. And usually it's the state that is assigned formally to inform communities. So you get away from just the company community relations. The other international shift in community relations is in indigenous rights. We have the 1989 adoption of the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, or ILO 169, by the International Labor Organization. This convention has been ratified by 15 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then these governments have then implemented regulations, specifically with regard to this process called prior consultation. And again, it's a rule about the state informing communities impacted by extraction about the new projects. In this case, it's specifically if communities are indigenous, it triggers this prior consultation process. So we do see the insertion of the state also in this moment where a new project is on the horizon and being considered. And in general, this state presence with project approvals and community participation, it has benefited companies a great deal. And my comments are really based on my research in Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru, but also based on secondary literature on prior consultation and public hearings for environmental licensing. The function of the state through these processes in general, in most cases, is about organizing and legitimizing company community relations and streamlining extraction. The participation is usually a single meeting. Communities do not have veto power over extraction, and the expertise and resources of the companies and the state can be overwhelming relative to communities. And I want to say one more thing. These are state-led processes, but they are very much structured around what's called the environmental impact study. This is the document that describes projects and their impacts, and therefore also defines the area impacted by a project, and therefore defines who gets to participate in these processes and who doesn't. So it's exclusive and divisive and can also weaken organizing. And who develops the EIA? It's the private contract, well, it's a private company contracted by the private extractive firm. So within this state-led process, very much formally, these private companies have a very strong voice as well. And I'll just close as a very important caveat. In most cases, these participatory processes are divisive and facilitate extraction. However, communities do mobilize and organize against extraction. Where communities have been powerfully organized, they have been able to use these participatory institutions very strategically and effectively to hold up extraction. And my comments in the second part of the session are about that, which is really the focus of my upcoming book. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Maiah. Fernando.
Well, it's really wonderful to be in this panel, and I want to thank all the panelists for for being here and the work of the cluster in setting it up. I'm going to share my my screen and show a PowerPoint presentation of a couple of slides that I think fold really well with what all the other panelists have presented. In Chile, I think we have observed over the last 10 years the emergence of a new paradigm that extractivism is using. And I call that paradigm early sociocultural and territorial embedding. If we look at the relationship between extractivist corporations and communities over the last 20 plus years, we see that they have gone through three stages. One stage of deaf ears, very authoritarian, dismissive of community demands from 1980 to 1999. A second stage, kind of a transactional approach where corporations tried to buy off individual community members and local officials from about 2000 and 2010. And then the new paradigm, the one that starts around 2011, which is territorial and sociocultural embedding at the local level. And that's what I have been studying over the last 4 years. To give you an example of what that mindset reflects, here's a quote from one of the private consulting firms that helps extractivist corporations deploy that strategy. And I'll read it. Nowadays, projects with local impact face the challenge of integrating into the intersubjective realities of the territories. That is the set of experiences, imaginaries, and expectations that define the community. So what these new strategies do with the help of these consulting firms is manipulate this dimension of the local reality so as to win the complicity of the community before the project enters into the environmental licensing stage, where, as Maiah and others have indicated, communities through community participation, indigenous consultation, have been able to deal tremendous defeats to these corporations. At a discursive level, these strategies come wrapped into these notions of early community involvement, territorial dialogue, and a real winner, legally binding, voluntary pre-investment agreements. I've seen how these have been implemented in a number of places. And of course, they also co-opt the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. At a political ideological level, our early community dialogue is harnessed as a technology of domination. Those community dialogues organized by these private consulting firms, many of them very progressive, allow for the mapping of the emotional and moral scaffolding that upholds community stances. There is a process also of syncing the temporalities of communities and of the state itself to the temporalities of capital by preempting the arising of these conflicts in the environmental licensing stage. And what is really innovative is that they install in these territories these private public corporations that privatize the state's role of territorial planning, legitimacy, and social cohesion production. And those tasks for entire provinces, not just the immediate territory where the extractivist operations take place, are assumed by these public-private corporations that have the extractivist corporations at the center. So these are strategies that manipulate place-based identities and implant the extractive corporation as a legitimate good neighbor in the territory and produce these supplicant subjectivities. And I think the last really defining characteristic is that these are being produced by these epistemic communities that are composed by multinational corporations, but also progressive consulting firms, along with state entities and academia. Why do they arise? Three basic reasons. Number one, the effective combination of territories and communities to use social mobilization with litigation in the environmental licensing stage. These projects now take 10 years to take off. 116 socio-environmental conflicts with a human rights dimension existing in 2016. 57 billion of investments paralyzed or detained, an equivalent of something like 20% of Chile's GDP. So these strategies need to be developed to defeat these very effective ways of territorial resistance. The second reason is that there is a shared policy between the state and the multinational corporations represented in the Consejo Minero to raise in Chile copper production from 5.5 million tons to 7.5 million tons by 2035. And what that means is expanding the frontiers of extractivism in copper and gold from the north and the high Andes, where it's been mostly located, to the Central Valley, to highly populated regions. And that means being able to deploy new strategies. And then the third role, I think, is the successful experience of these progressive consulting firms serving transnational capital in the task of conflict management. So in our research, we look at the state, the private corporations, and the community organizations. But I think given these new strategies, we need to incorporate the role of these private consulting firms, which in Chile are like Casa para la Paz, Tironia Asociados, Dinámica Plataforma, Espacio Público, and many others, people by progressive social scientists that do the dirty work of extractivist corporations. In my work, I study kind of three variants of these. At a national level, Valor Minero and its proposal to create an agency for territorial dialogue. In brownfield projects, where corporations have to atone for past sins, the role of Tironia Asociados, and the political technology of gestión abierta de controversias, which they've deployed in many places, but I study particularly the Choapa Valley and the mine of Los Penambres. And then in greenfield projects, like Nueva Union's, Newmont, and Tech Resources in Valle de Huasco, and also in Valle de Putaendo, this strategic analysis of territorial sustainability being crafted by Dinámica Plataforma. And I'll end there because I don't know how much more time I have, and we'll take up other questions in the discussions.
Thanks, Fernando. I want to take just 1 second to remind the attendees that if you have a question you'd like to ask the panelists, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your question. And towards the end of the event, Tomás Gison Labelle will collect these questions and ask the panelists for the last round of questions. So now I want to move to the second question that we've asked the panelists is this. What implications do these evolving strategies carry for ongoing struggles over extractivism? What implications do they carry for how we think about extractive governance in Latin America more broadly? And so we'll go back to the panelists and we'll actually go in reverse order. So Fernando, you're up again. And this time we'd like to keep it to responses to 5 minutes. Fernando.
All right, here we go. I think we face, what I'm seeing in the different territories in Huasco, in Choapa, and now in the Putaendo Valley, is kind of 5 challenges that I want to share with all of you. And number one, we really need to update our scholarly frameworks and research agenda overcome the binary institutional centric lens so that we can incorporate these new alliances and actors that are being used. I think that means, as many of you have suggested and Nate indicated at the opening words, which is one of the goals of the cluster, to pay attention to how material and discursive practices interact. I think we're seeing in Chile for the last 10 years or more, the emergence of new technologies of political domination that manipulate other realms of social relations, identity, memory, emotion, affect, in the service of extractivism. And the problem is that to do that, we need to shift the way that we produce knowledge about extractivism. We can't figure that out from sitting in our desks or from doing archival research. We need to really find ways of engaging with communities to co-create knowledge for transformation. So I think that's the first challenge. There's a second challenge, which is, how do we counter the rise of this new capitalist state, civil society, academic complex that is justifying the expansion of extractivism? This is a very powerful new alliance. They've been working at it for 10 years. They have colonized many realms of Chilean society. I mean, to give you an example, the chief press officer of the incoming Presidente Gabriel Boric worked for many years as the person in charge of communications for Dinámica Plataforma, and she worked aiding the media work of Dominga, one of the most hated extractivist projects here in Chile. There is a threat to the quality of democracy represented by the erasure of public-private boundaries that these new territorial management entities like Somos Choapa and others present, because there is a privatization of the tasks of territorial planning, of legitimacy construction, of social cohesion production, which is taken away from the state and transferred to these private-public corporations that are financed and that have the extractivist corporation at the core of its, at the heart. Dinámica Plataforma and Newman and Tech, for example, developed a hoja de ruta, a plan for the sustainable development of the province of Huasco, a private endeavor that really leaves the state and political communities outside of any voice-making possibilities. I think the most difficult is, how do we forge an antidote to the ontological occupation of territories? In these poor communities, these corporations arise, and they're the ones that gather the community to ask them, what are your dreams? What are your demands? How do you imagine things? And the alternatives that are built have extractivism and that corporation at the center. And finally, something that I find, when I go to southern Chile, to northern Chile, central Chile, to talk about these issues, is that communities need to become more aware about these strategies. They tell me, Fernando, don't think you're telling us anything new. We are experiencing these technologies in our communities. What you've done is you've given them a name and you've shown us how they connect to other actors. What is the broader networks of influence? But so I think we also, as scholars, as engaged scholars, we need to figure out how to help the people most directly affected by them, how to become more aware about what these strategies imply.
Thank you, Fernando. Now turn to Maiah.
Hi. Okay. So Fernando had very dark comments and wonderful comments. My comments are maybe more optimistic and maybe naively so, but kind of thinking about what's possible in the future. So going back to these participatory institutions that I was talking about and how they can disorganize and divide and weaken communities, where there has been community organizing in a serious way, communities have very powerfully used these institutions to hold up extraction. And I think based on my analysis of different conflicts, I think that there's the potential, this is kind of looking ahead, there is the potential for more expansive definitions of impacts and more inclusion of more communities, and basically more on the table where there's discussion of what is going to be approved and what won't be approved. There and in a few dynamics I see. One is that we do see signs of more expansive interpretations of what is being impacted by extraction. We have communities challenging the environmental impact studies and triggering external audits, and external audits producing reports that say, yes, indeed, the area of impact was much greater than what the company claimed. And we have also domestic and international court decisions, and those citing one another, and especially citing domestic court citing international decisions on prior consultation. Also defining more broadly, pushing for broader definitions of what's an impact on an Indigenous community, therefore which communities should be consulted. There's also a stretching when it comes to prior consultation, a stretching of the of what the consultation's about, even moving into the realm of consent requirements, where certain types of impacts do require consent. And it's interesting because the courts from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and also domestic courts are starting to interpret kind of adding to ILO 169 and in saying what kinds of impacts in fact require community consent. And these types of court cases and struggles and battles have shut down projects. So, you know, it's interesting, these participatory institutions that, you know, on paper don't look like much, in fact, might in the future mean something much more. And I think they're starting to in some places and in some contexts. And then I'll just say as a closing note, and this is what my book's about, even more immediately, communities have very strategically used these participatory institutions to shut down projects. Communities who are left out of projects demand inclusion, call completed processes illegitimate for not including them. This has been very effective. Communities that are included because they're that close to the project have refused to participate and have stalled project development using that technique. And then finally, I'll say that where communities are highly mobilized and organized to change or stop or stall extraction, if they participate in these processes, it doesn't weaken them from what I've found. So, you know, there are some interesting and unanticipated positive outcomes of these very limited formal participatory institutions when we're talking about new extraction. Thank you.
Thank you, Maiah. I'll hand it to Jen now.
Thanks very much, Nate. I want to spring off of Maia's final comments in terms of how organized communities and peoples have been using these institutions to hold up or stop projects. And just to reiterate that I think these are precisely the cases where corporations have been bringing some of their most costly suits against governments. We've just seen one threatened against Ecuador for a constitutional court decision that upheld the decision of the Environment Ministry to revoke its permit because of threats to environmental rights. There's 5 suits right now against Colombia for projects that are held up either over environmental regulatory decisions or over questions to suspend expansion of a mine out of respect for Indigenous people's rights, and similarly in Guatemala, other parts of the country. And so I think these suits, although we can't say that these suits have turned back those decisions or enabled those projects to advance further, I think there is a serious question as to how it will put a further chill on the decisions of those regulatory bodies and the decisions of those governments and how they interpret and implement their law moving forward. And I just want to add a different sort of interpretation that I've also seen organized communities and peoples taking, which is to, given the extent of corporate capture under the terms of militarized neoliberal extractivism, which is what they're living in which not only their governments captured by the terms of these neoliberal treaties and investment protection agreements, but also in which there's been a corresponding, and there wasn't really time to talk about this at the beginning, but over the last 20 years, deepening of the rules to criminalize, militarize, and make resource-rich territories highly dangerous places to be, and especially as organized communities, but even as in general ways. I think what we're seeing in Mexico and Central America and parts of Colombia as well is how, in addition to the private security bodies, the public security bodies, that there's also paramilitary and illegal armed groups that are also enforcing the interests of the resource industry. And so I think, just nod to an important strategy that I've seen a lot of communities in Mesoamerica adopting, which is a concept of prevention, and not waiting for the presence of the company to be on their territory, but to map out where there are interests or potential interests in mineral extraction, and using their own and reinforcing their own decision-making bodies and forms of taking decisions in order to assert their rights to declare their territories free of extractive industry. That is clearly something that has helped where there are stronger land rights, where there are stronger territorial rights of affected people. But I think that these demonstrations and assertions of autonomy and self-determination are a critical and important response to the depth of corporate capture of state agencies and governments, and also the extreme risks, not only from environmental and health harms as a result of extractive industry, but also the serious social disruption, violence, and militarization that has been increasingly accompanying these projects. And just on a more global level, just sort of two reflections that I have in terms of struggle. I do feel like this web of international investment agreements is a threat to any of our goals that might have to do with corporate accountability and addressing impunity or ecological protection and respect for people's rights, and that we have to see the links between these imposed political and economic and legal structures that give corporations a law above the law, and that is a serious obstruction to any of these goals. And just to a concern too about, especially in the mining industry, the implications of a technological shift as part as rather than and a green growth model as a solution to the energy transition, which is being used in wild ways by governments and the industry right now to further justify and their interest in to greenwash the industry that, you know, they're now speculating could jump 30 or even 800 times in the demand for certain metals and minerals moving forward. And so just a real onus on all of us to be thinking about opportunities to just radically cut energy and material demand moving forward if we hope to alleviate some of the pressures that are being felt by Indigenous peoples and affected communities.
Thank you, Jan. And we will go to Anna.
Thank you. Well, my comments square very well with what Jennifer and Maiah and Fernando have already addressed, and maybe agree in some respects and depart in other respects. So, you know, I'm both more optimistic and more pessimistic, I guess, than for Fernando, taking off from what Maiah had said, in that I don't think the firms have been especially successful on the whole. So this doesn't necessarily mean that communities across the Americas have managed to stop projects, but the number of sites of contention all over North America. So, you know, I'm not speaking here only of Latin America, but also thinking of the country called Canada and, you know, the United States as well. The number of projects that have been heavily contested by communities is significant and growing. And, you know, there's a lot of different organizations that have mapped this, including, you know, the Barcelona-based group and some colleagues of ours, you know, in Montreal, who have been looking at the number of environmental conflicts. And I think that those kinds of projects and just the role of communities in pushing back against particular, you know, proposals has been enough to scare off capital in certain ways, so that, you know, all of the economic social governance type environmental social governance initiatives receive attention because negative press coverage does influence the ability of firms to access capital and does increase insurance costs. But as that has occurred, the role of state financing has also increased. So I'm going to try to share, let's see if I can share this, but in some work that my colleague Leiva Hernandez Cervantes and I did on, you know, the role of Canada in the denationalization of the Mexican energy sector, which was implemented in 2014, and which to a limited extent López Obrador has, you know, pushed back on. You know, there was significant influence of the main oil and gas industry lobbies in the US, Canada, and Mexico, which represent private interests in the implementation of that policy of you know, the passing of this highly controversial and also quite extreme shift, you know, that had been going on for some decades, but was very marked as of 2014, a major restructuring of the Mexican oil and gas industry. And in the research that Maiah and I did, you know, using her sort of concept of the kind of juridical power, we looked at all the role of a lot of different kinds of institutions in shaping that legislation, which included transnationals, included, you know, various branches of formal government in Canada and elsewhere, included university partnerships, which here Fernando has, you know, raised in the Chilean context, that were directly, you know, supported by what is now Global Affairs Canada. So, you know, there's this direct role of the state. At the same time, there's also a sort of pushing back on the state through the use of its own language. So, you know, if there was more time, I'd talk a little bit more about what I think is what the role global transparency discourse has played in shaping the terrain and the debates around corporate regulation. But what I'll just say here briefly is that while initially, you know, transparency discourse was really geared towards exporting typically global South states for corruption, I think to some extent it's been turned on its head by activists to demonstrate, you know, through things like WikiLeaks and the Panama Papers, the extent to which elite capital is, you know, equally or more embedded in nefarious financial activity. And I think that all of that has, you know, increased media attention as well to the role that that state financing plays in facilitating sort of dubious activities. So, you know, Export Development Canada is a big purveyor of risk capital to highly controversial projects. With relation to, you know, all of Jennifer's and her colleague, you know, the crucial work that you have done on ISDS, I was wondering, sort of preparing for today, there's this currently highly contentious project in Oaxaca in Mexico for tuna silver, and Canada is behind it. Maybe Jen will be able to respond to this later, but I did wonder if perhaps there might, you know, initially the Morena government, López Obrador had, you know, they had canceled, in principle, they had sort of canceled the permiso to that project, and then they have reneged on that. And I did wonder if there might be a threat of investor-state arbitration, you know, playing a role there. So certainly pressure from the Canadian government, which I'm sure is you know, one will eventually be able to find through access to information and privacy. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everybody for those wonderful presentations. I am going to hand it over to Tomas now, who will be coordinating the questions coming from the cluster members. And panelists, you should feel free in your response, or if you already know right now, to ask questions of the other panelists also. So Tomas.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much, Nate. First, well, thank you for your excellent presentation. I think we're really starting to touch a bit of the core of the debate that is emerging there. Well, that I see emerging, but I'm not going to be the only one asking questions. Other members of the cluster will ask questions, because since we invited you, we also wanted to take a little space to tell you that we read your work, we want to interact with your work. So that's a bit the reason why we invited you. So, but one of the things that I saw, the debate that was happening in between here is, I wonder if we don't have an issue with the level of abstraction, to make it that way, but is that we have debates about very different cases, and I wonder if the general lessons apply to all the cases in the same way, because I'm thinking about the Mexican case that Anna, you've worked on very much, and the integration of the Mexican law through NAFTA with the American and Canadian state in terms of the lawmaking process isn't at another level than it might be in other places. So I wonder if we don't have this issue that can explain maybe also the tension that I saw in the kind of presentation that Fernando and Maiah were doing, where Maiah seemed more optimistic about the potential of international law, of providing spaces of the communities to act. Whereas in the case of Chile, it seems to be very local, the capacity of local companies and local epistemic communities to shape what is going on. Therefore, their kind of deep penetration they can have may subvert the community will in a different way. So all this to say that one of my questions, the questions I wanted to ask is, should we think about it more locally so that the conclusion do not apply all across the board, or you tend to see, and maybe Jen can come in on that because she studied also very many cases through her work, are there common trends in this, or should we have a local lens to see this relationship between the capacity of community, of state and companies to influence those processes? That's the first question. But then the second question is kind of to frame it in a way too simplistic terms, is who's the real bad guy here? Or, well, I'll leave it in masculine terms, but because sometimes we feel that the companies are the driver of those transformation processes. But when I listen to Fernando, it seems that there's the driver as the site for driving has changed, and it's more a space in between companies, state, private consulting. So the pressure is not exactly the company itself. The company would accept to bow to some of the demands of the community in order to accommodate this kind of epistemic community. Is it coming from the international corporation straight down? And in this case, we can also wonder if the transnational or multinational mining corporation are nationalists in the sense that they would defend the country where they're based from. And so, or is it the state that still holds the thing together, or is it completely captured in all the cases you're studying? So that's the two questions I wanted to ask. And then I think other cluster members would like to come in to contribute to that. And after that, we'll go to the question and answer from the public. Tamara Alejandra Alejo.
Yes, can I go?
Tamara.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting. And I would like to make two questions for all the panelists. The questions are related to the state, the role of the state, and the color of the state. First, because well, for us, like I'm from Chile, so I tend to have a very dark view too, as Fernando. So even though I think these international agreements and conventions are real helpful too today, I've seen how specifically the 1989 Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention has been in a certain way adapted and adjusted and even avoided during a long time from the state. So it's not usual that people have the chance to use this international convention, unfortunately. But Maiah, you said that the states have changed their role recently, facilitating and legitimizing extraction. So I was wondering what the other panelists think, in the sense that if we can really observe a change after the pandemic, because I think recently we have been talking about the open space after there is no alternative started with the neoliberal policies. And we can see today that there was a kind of open space, and it seems that the state reinvigorated their role during the pandemic. So I wonder if this reinvigoration is real for the extraction activities or not, or what are you seeing that is coming after the pandemic? Is a real new role in this continuation of neoliberalism or post-neoliberal era? How you are seeing this shift or this new context and changes? And then, because it's so interesting how Anna Zalik, for example, have identified this new frontier for extraction, when the finance capital has shown that the space for the conflict is not located for this social contestation, it's outside of social contestation, the finance capital. So it seems that there are many changes, how we can see the role of the state there. And then, if you have observed any changes or differences within these different colors of the state, because today we can see something that some scholars have called neo-extractivism or progressive extractivism in Latin America, for example. If you can identify any differences that are interested to pay attention in between different governments, because the state is not equal everywhere. Right? Thank you.
I don't know if Alejandra or Alejo want to ask a last question before we go back to the panelists. Alejandra.
I have a question, but I wonder if that's enough for the panelists for now. It seems like there's a lot on your plate, or should I just? I'll ask a small one and then a smaller one. Well, first one is to Jen. Well, thank you all so much for being here, for giving these great presentations. It's such a pleasure to finally not just read your work, but to meet you and see you talk about it. So I'm just so grateful for you being here. One question I had for Jen in particular, just because I've also read your work a little bit more extensively and have some experience in doing this research myself about these kind of disputes at the international level. I would love if you could say a little bit more about the lose-lose situation for countries. You kind of touched on it, but just how even if you win one of those cases, like in the case of El Salvador, the local communities don't look at it as a victory, but actually the system is designed in such a way so that you always lose if you're the community. So if you could touch on that, I would really appreciate that. And then maybe for kind of the overlying theme that I got from all of you is just the multiple fronts and the multiple scales that challenge communities in resistance to extractivism. From kind of the legal challenges to the discursive or kind of reputational challenges to even like the blunt force challenges of day-to-day existence and survival in such dangerous situations, whether it's long-term danger from the environmental catastrophes or day-to-day danger of living in some of the world's most violent communities. So from this perspective, then what then becomes a solution? I know it's kind of often we say, well, what can communities do? But when we kind of branch out these scales and these multifaceted kind of nature of this beast, it seems to me we also need to branch out in terms of how we define the community and who's actually doing the resistance many different scales and on these different fronts. So if you could kind of touch on that in terms of how it influences your work. What are the implications, I guess, if we look at this complexity then, of how does that translate into a more complex resistance, and who is doing the resistance? So it's the flip side to Tomas's question of who's the bad guy, who needs to be the good guys in this scenario. Thank you.
So who wants to go first?
I think if Maiah, you're able to start, that'd be great. If we could keep it to 5 minutes or so each, I think that we won't be able to answer every question asked, but yeah, and feel free to interact with the other panelists and ask questions. Go ahead, Maiah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And again, it's been such a pleasure participating. I see really several wonderful questions. Let me start with this question of scale, because it's come up a couple times. And I think I think what I would say is, if we start at the local level, which I think is very valuable, this is something I do, we can focus on the many, many, many cases of capture, coercion, environmental degradation, destruction of socioeconomic structures that exist there and cultural practices, and we can get very depressed, and probably rightfully so. And that's and that's one face of the local level. But I think given the asymmetry in power relations, whether we're focusing on the state and companies or these other larger communities that implicate including academics and NGOs, considering the asymmetry at the local level in so many cases, to ignore the cases where communities and their allies hold up multi-billion-dollar investments and projects that have the potential to be the leading copper mine in the region, and one of the top 3 in the world, that have shut down gold projects that could be, in the top 5 in the world. To ignore those conflicts and the power and how that comes together, I think is a shame, right? So if we're going to focus on the local level, we should value both possibilities and both outcomes that we do see. And then I also think that sometimes the value of the local level can cause these chain reactions with broader implications nationally and potentially internationally. And so, where I see a conflict lead to a court case that then affects future prior consultation processes, that's interesting to me as well. And then finally, what Jen Moore does is just fantastic and so interesting. A couple of my conflicts involved cases that got to these international arbitrations, and where the state did lose and had to pay many millions of dollars. And I think that, that big question of, do certain cases then cause different behaviors on states across time at kind of a large N or very high level is, fascinating. So I certainly think there are really important, interesting questions at these different levels. I think I have just maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. This question about the state post, I guess very quickly, different extractivist governments, does it matter? Do they act differently? I studied Bolivia under Evo Morales. That was the period I was studying for the Bolivian case, where you have a kind of an indigenous movement aligned president, very much on the left. But my framework that focus very much on extractivist states trying to extract, and in the face of indigenous demands, that pattern held just in Bolivia as it held in Colombia, as it held in Peru. So that was my finding for my research. And then the final quick case, post-pandemic, or what are we seeing? Based on broader research and what we're seeing, I think we're seeing an incredible increase in the role of the state in the economy with social welfare programs and all of that with the pandemic. I think that's very real. In extraction, what we see and what the research cluster has laid out very nicely in their document, we absolutely have seen countries in kind of concerned about economic crisis associated with the pandemic, and therefore trying to prop up and hold and support the extractive sector. And we do see that. And one case that's very interesting to me in Peru, this major mining conflict that just keeps going over Las Bambas, for people interested or familiar with it. The state explicitly in Peru implemented these kinds of stay-at-home orders, which we've seen during the pandemic. There was a period where there were lots of stay-at-home orders. Therefore, you couldn't go out in the streets with lots of people for any reason. And then overlapping the pandemic stay-at-home orders were orders that you couldn't organize, and it was kind of melded with the mining conflict. And this triggered tremendous backlash and lawsuits again, saying you can't control our, you can't deprive us of the right to protest and organize, and you can't use the pandemic as an excuse to try to support your this mine. And they've been successful in some cases getting high court decisions. So I wonder if in the mess of the pandemic, if we might have important backlashes that could set precedent to in fact protect community rights. And so I'll close there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Maiah. How about Anna?
Okay, I'll try to respond sort of quickly to things. So, on Thomas's initial question, I agree that when we look regionally at political cultures, at all sorts of different domestic political questions, we're talking about apples, oranges, etc. I think, if the focus is on capital and the firm no one sees, you go to the list of directors of a particular company and you see that they've worked in half the countries in Latin America and West Africa, and somebody in the mining industry. So I looked up this particular firm, Fortuna Silver, recently. This person has also worked in Shell, right? So that the webs of participation in firms are very strong. This is something my colleague David Zablowski often underlines, that the practices are also sort of translated and employed across these corporate networks. And thus we're seeing them implement similar practices. I've seen quite a few parallels between things that are done in the Alberta tar sands and things that are done in the Niger Delta. And there are these global networks where people meet and talk to one another about corporate strategies. So that would be one thought. The other, is, and here more optimistic and maybe echoing some of Maia's points, there are also transnational networks against particular firms. There's been massive organizing by established NGOs and also by much more kind of grassroots groups against the activities of particular companies. A colleague of ours at York, Judith Marshall, has followed this transnational network against Vale, which has brought together affected communities in Brazil and South Africa. So, there is also the ways in which communities in very different places are seeing themselves impacted by one firm, which of course has many tentacles in global capital, and hence, find ways to affect that firm's global reputation collectively. There's been, the outstanding work, in Mexico, there's an organization, Geocomunes, that maps the infrastructure, the mining, and, as well as the hydrocarbon infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, and the kinds of material, they have brought to light by sort of turning the whole transparency discourse on its head, has also enabled a lot of different critical activity by academics and also, by social movements, so they can see who is where, even recognizing that the money changes and that it's very difficult to have a snapshot that's accurate because capital is constantly in flux and there's constantly name changes in different firms associated with projects, but still you get a snapshot of where the kind of where the projects are and where the sort of important territories are. And then maybe just two other final points. Actually, I wasn't timing myself, so I don't know if I'm at time, but Tamara raised the questions of post-pandemic shifts and the reinvigoration of the role of the state in planning. And I think at the beginning of the pandemic, many of us who identify with the left were very optimistic, that there was sort of a shift towards recognizing the need for central planning for redistribution of wealth. And here being more pessimistic, I feel that the volatility that we now see in global markets has allowed a lot of space for kind of smaller pockets of capital to speculate and make money. And in the question of deep sea mining, which is one of the things I've been following for the last 8 or 10 years, there has been a lot of attention recently to this special purpose acquisition company that was housed in Canada called the Metals Company, that was the merging of a deep sea mining company called Deep Green with Sustainable SOAC, which was the name for another basically venture capital body that was going to provide the financing for Deep Green to move forward as the metal companies with highly costly and also highly risky mining in the seabed beyond national jurisdiction. And so these kinds of new financial mechanisms are hard to track, and I think are in a sense kind of echo, they're reverberating negatively on the possibility of the state taking more of a role. And so finally on this, because I think there was a bit of I took it as somewhat as a reference to some extent also to Fernando's crucial work on neostructuralism, which I have thought about quite a bit in the Mexican context, and even more so recently, because I was one of these people that was pretty optimistic when López Obrador came to power, and I think that what one sees under Mexico has a particular, different sets of features associated with, a much more nationalized energy sector than much of the Andes, so it had specific features that distinguished it. But the overall role of the state in sort of managing capital and in seeking more redistributive outcomes, that was Mexican corporatism for most of the 20th century under the PRI. And so I think there was a hope for a less elite-driven version of that under López Obrador. And I wonder if really global capital markets, if the kinds of mechanisms, that Jennifer and colleagues have tracked, if all of the legal cases that Maiah was discussing, if these kinds of features ultimately empower capital and disempower the state, the more progressive branches of the state, to the extent that there are progressive branches of the state. So, yes, and the good guys. Alejandro, you raised the good guys. I still, I really wanted to hope that the current government in Mexico was the good guys. And I guess there's a part of me that feels that even if they wanted to be the good guys, I don't know whether they could be, because of global capital and because of the, the existence of a Guzman after 2.0 and the kinds of constraints it places on the state.
Thank you, Anna.
Fernando?
Your mic is off, Fernando. Your mic.
Okay. I hate to do death by PowerPoint, but I want to share my screen to make what I think is a really important point. I think all of these questions, the articulation between the local, the national, the transnational, about the role of the state, about optimism, pessimism, etc. We need to incorporate the stage of the development of the mining project. A mining project usually goes through these, 7? A pre-feasibility study, a feasibility and design study, an environmental permitting stage, the construction, the operation, the closure. What Maiah is talking about, the success that communities have had, the optimism she feels is because precisely during the environmental permitting stage, citizen participation mechanisms, indigenous consultation mechanisms have allowed communities to win. We know that in Chile, Barrick, the most powerful gold transnational was defeated in that stage of the process. Hydroisen, was also defeated. The recent, under the table licensing to a couple of corporations of lithium was also defeated in this stage. Precisely because communities have been able to use these mechanisms so successfully, the new strategies seek to create and operate in the earlier stage, in the feasibility and design stage. This is early territorial dialogue, voluntary pre-investment agreements, so that all community members sign an agreement with the corporation before it goes to the environmental licensing stage. So these new strategies designed by the corporations in Chile, by these consulting firms, are precisely to preempt the community from using the legally sanctioned citizen participation, indigenous consultation mechanisms that they already have. It's to take that away from them. So I think, understanding the stage of the project is really crucial for answering a lot of the questions that have been raised here. The role of the state in this feasibility and design stage, the role of NGOs is to facilitate the privatization and corporate management of these processes. It's very different than the role that the state plays in the environmental permitting stage. I hope that's clear. And Chile is the world's top producer of copper, and many of the political economic projects, Popular Front, 1936, Revolución en Libertad, the answer to the Cuban Revolution designed by the US empire, the peaceful transition to socialism, neoliberalism, neo-structuralism, all of those have arisen in Chile. And what I'm arguing is that these new technologies of power that extractivism is going to deploy throughout Latin America and worldwide are being produced here locally. And we need to pay attention. So I'm tremendously optimistic about the dignity of local communities and their capacity of resistance. I'm not so optimistic about the capacity of academics to get on board and to understand the dynamics that are actually happening. In that sense, I want to ask Jen one question. I think this idea of the chilling effect and the way that corporations deploy these agreements is really crucial to incorporate into the story. Los Andes Copper, operating in Putaendo, opposed by 85% of the local community, the mayor, is threatening to use the free trade agreement, Chile-Canada. So my question, and what I would like Jen to talk about, is there a way of monitoring before the actual suit is filed to get a sense of that chilling effect?
Thanks, Fernando. And yeah, let's turn over to Jen.
Thank you, Fernando, and it's. I'm glad you showed that slide. It left me thinking if feasibility design is actually early stage or late stage. And if by then there's already a lot of corporate insertion that that communities would be wise to get organized even before things get there. I'm gonna jump around a little bit. There's a lot that's been said and a lot of really interesting comments to think about. Who's the bad guy stuck with me? And I just wanted to add to the list of the bad guys because it's not one. But I think the international financial institutions and the role of the World Bank also can't be underestimated. I mean, in terms of defining what is development, and that the influence that has in terms of economic development model, how that's played out in the global South, and thinking about the role of the World Bank in the reforms of mining codes in over 100 countries around the world in the 80s and 90s that sort of set the stage for where we are today, and the role that the World Bank and other IFIs are playing now in terms of pushing mining as the solution, as like the next big thing for the energy transition, and how this is more like, as Hale Comunes had said in Mexico, a market transition where we're just gonna, you know, take the abuses and the destruction of our climate of the global north and now shift it and destroy all the communities that have copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and such metals under their feet in their homes. And on ISDS, and maybe starting with, why is it always a lose-lose for states, even when they may come out and the company, they may not have to pay the company great deals of money in compensation. I mean, we say it's a lose-lose solution, and maybe using the specific example of El Salvador to illustrate this a little bit. El Salvador being a country that was sued for 7 years by a Canadian mining company that failed to get an environmental permit to put in operation a gold mine because it never actually abided by the mining law, let alone the environmental regulations, and never had the land, legal title to the land that it needed to claim that permit. Even though the company was not awarded amounts of money, El Salvador still had to pay millions of dollars to it. Legal counsel over the period of 7 years. There was a 7-year chill put on the desire to have a mining ban in that entire country. There was 4 people murdered during that people of time, other people that were threatened. So all of that created a whole context of uncertainty, of stress. And I think the thing that these arbitration cases do, especially now I'm working more closely with other communities and some other parts of the region on these sorts of cases, is it's so distant. It is so outside of their own control and reality. And El Salvador was an unusual circumstance. And sorry, we have a street salesperson going by here, very loud microphone. There was a unique amount of coordination between the state's legal counsel and the social movements and the affected communities that is very hard to guarantee in other contexts and other struggles where there are these sorts of arbitration cases. And I think all of the organizing around this requires, a strong local base, but always these sorts of transnational networks to fight effectively against them. I do think that that was something that was unique in that case. And I would just say that it's also lose-lose, because I think that the international investment agreements are just in a violation of sovereignty and people's self-determination. They so constrain the state, and not just the state. I think some of the data that we've been finding recently is, the states didn't voluntarily revoke these mining licenses or these environmental licenses or respect people's self-determination. This is hard fought for community struggle over years. And so I feel like these arbitration suits, the state is not a single entity. And now we're seeing all these suits against the constitutional court decisions that have nothing to do with the central government, but rather the judiciary that's responding to cases that communities and NGOs and other civil society groups have brought. And so these arbitration cases are actually against them and against their hard fought for achievements. And they have no place in the arbitration process. It's the state against the company. So I do think that there's a real loss in terms of self-determination and sovereignty just by the mere existence of these structures. And I think the question around how do we study the chilling effects, I also think this is really important, and I could name a couple of other cases where I think this is operated. I think there's a myriad of ways. I think tracking those few, those threats that come out in the media from companies that say that they might sue, I think that stuff has got to be documented. We got to keep track of that. Access to information requests, both in the national context as well as of home embassies. With Los Andes Cooper, I would go after the Canadian embassy. I would start to file access to information requests in Canada to figure out what's the embassy been doing, what's Global Affairs Canada been doing. It's a very active agency on behalf of the global mining industry. So I think we can't always have it sort of in real time, But sometimes you can, and I think, and I do think it does put the brakes on some of the most creative and ambitious efforts that there have been. And I just want to talk about one other example. In 2008, and in a neo-extractivist context in Ecuador, under the first mandate of Rafael Correa, there was a mining mandate that got put into place that would have revoked, had it actually been implemented, almost all the mining concessions in that whole country. Because it was for overlap with water supplies, overlap natural protected areas, for lack of prior consultation, all sorts of things. It did not. 98% of the companies in the project at that time were owned by Canadian capital. And there's no doubt that they were threatening to sue the pants off of the government forever and ever if it touched any of the most advanced projects. And I mean, and some of that came out and some of it didn't come out, but it was just, and there was a whole bunch of access to information requests done by other researchers that showed that. But I do think that the chill effect is important in terms of really seeing some of those bigger questions. I will end there. There's a whole lot of other things that have come up that are really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. And now I'll turn it back over to Tomas to bring some questions from the audience.
Yes. So we had 4 questions, but actually one of the people who asked the question left, so I'm going to skip his question in order to save the time for those who stayed. Nancy Wright is asking, can you discuss the interrelationship of extractivism with capitalism, racism, and imperialism? Isn't this what neocolonialism looks like? How can there ever be real justice within the context of imperialist-dominated world? That's Nancy Wright. Narda Nelson goes, thank you for raising the point of undercurrents across extractive government, Maiah. In the meantime of COVID lockdowns, were mining projects allowed to proceed on the ground? The Site C Dam and tar sands project here in Canada had that duplicity, hypocrisy of whose bodies could continue moving. I think you said in the chat that as far as you're concerned, as far as you're aware, they've been allowed to continue. And then Luke Ansel asked, thank you. I am heavy equipment operator, and a part of my wage try to and contribute to the education of industrial practices and is to be aware of business practices, materials used, processes, etc. As someone who is directly involved in this industry, how can I communicate with my coworkers and with superiors the importance of ethical practices? So these are the 3 questions that you have that give you a chance to make a concluding remark, I guess.
And let me add that I think we want to probably go about 3 minutes per person to end by 11:30. So we can go ahead and start with Jen.
Maybe I could I'm interested in responding to the question around what's happened during the pandemic, and just to say, because we've just been recently trying to map what's been going on in the coalition of organizations, and to say that mining was declared essential or in the national interest almost immediately at the start of the pandemic in most countries in Latin America, with the exception of Mexico, Honduras, and Panama. But strangely, the companies managed to either get themselves declared essential within about a month and a half, or were actually the measures were never effectively applied to their operations. Panama being a particularly interesting example where there's only one operating mine, Cobre Panama, a very, very large copper mine. And they had an exemption from the start. They ended up getting closed down because there were so many COVID deaths in the first couple months, but largely they were able to keep going. And to say that the pandemic has been really good for mining. The mining industry has had banner years in 2020 and 2021. Gold was a major go-to in the uncertainty of the global economy shut down. Copper, other base metals really started to go through the roof when the Chinese economy started up again. And with the speculation going on around energy, metals, and minerals as well, all of this has done fairly well. That's not to say every company did great, but the industry by and large has had a really good a really good run of things, and the reflections that we're hearing from communities and organizations through this time. And I think just a shout out to Alejandro, having had the opportunity to see some forthcoming work and these ideas of disaster extractivism, and how, you know, the mining industry, the extractivist industries will use any opportunity. And I don't think, you know, they cared that people were, you know, have the double burden of having to stay safe themselves, take care of the healthcare of their loved ones. And people are been overwhelmed. And it's, you know, it's been a hard couple of years, I think, generally for a lot of people. And this is certainly what we're hearing from defenders and affected communities. And just, you know, for almost a year, any of the efforts, you know, this growing asymmetry, not being able to access, you know, where communities had an administrative process with authorities or with the justice system, most of that was shut down for months at a time, and slowed down their efforts. And so, and sort of thinking about Fernando's division between whether you had an operating mine that either just kept going and continuing to try to expand itself, continuing to get permits, continuing to go at business as usual, or mines that are still in the project phase, also continuing to try to get their permits through, and in conditions that have just been that much more difficult for affected peoples and organizations throughout this time. I think none of that could be underestimated. I would just flag 3 examples where at the policy and plan level, Panama, Ecuador have got concerted plans to try to explicitly making mining a solution for the economic reactivation. Multiple governments have talked about it that way, more discursively. But just to maybe land on a very positive note, in Chubut, Argentina, historic resistance, where for 20 years they've had a prohibition of effective prohibition of mining in the province. Right before Christmas, a Canadian mining company with the provincial government tried to overturn the 20-year-long ban, and they did, and then 5 days later had to put it back. Because there was just such massive outpouring of resistance and thousands of people in the streets. And they've done a remarkable job building on this history of struggle and building on this history of organization to keep going despite all of the constraints of the pandemic. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jen. Fernando.
I'm going to tackle only one question, and that's the comment about by the heavy machine operator on the importance of ethical practices. I think, you know, that question raises the issue of the importance of incorporating workers from these corporations and the subcontracted companies into the picture of both you know, resistance and implementation. I just want to highlight that Barrick was defeated. Remember that for Barrick, Chile and Argentina created a special binational zone that, you know, so Barrick had its own set of rules that were neither Chilean or Argentinian. So environmental groups, local authorities did not have access to what was going on at the Barrick exploration site. It was a heavy machine operator that videoed how Barrick was destroying these highland glaciers that started the whole campaign, that fueled the whole campaign against Barrick. That operator felt that it was ethically wrong, the destruction of what was the source of life for the entire valley where he lived. So I think that, you know, this is a really important question that, you know, we also need to help support answer that question. How to, you know, open up those discussions within the workers, both male and female, both permanent and subcontracted in these mining operations. And they're certainly not going to read our academic papers and you know, our discourse analysis. So we need to figure out, you know, other means that we can support those discussions among the workers that make, you know, our life possible.
Thank you, Fernando. Anna.
Thank you. So I think, you know, the question that was raised about imperialism and racism and colonialism, which is something that, you know, I don't think any of us really directly addressed. but I think is crucial, and I appreciate also the comments that Narda has put in the chat about this. You know, I'd raise here that I think that ultimately the ability of capital to behave as it does in the global South is an expression of imperialism, colonialism, and global racialization in many respects. And in the Canadian context, it's equally so. And so I'll just, you know, maybe say a little bit about the example of TC Energy, formerly TransCanada Pipelines, the firm behind the Keystone XL pipeline. You know, I mean, as Jennifer is pointing out, the mining industry has had a better year. At the beginning, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, it appeared briefly that maybe the oil and gas industry was, you know, on its way out the door, that the critical minerals, that all of the discussion around lithium and various other, you know, supposedly rare earths, which, you know, we know through Julie Klinger's work are not so rare, but, you know, that all of these minerals were going to displace the hydrocarbons. And now we see hydrocarbons on the upswing, and we see how geopolitical wrangling is actually shaping that global market. And so it's really, you know, this shifting kind of global hegemony and competition between the US and Russia and China that is influencing those markets right now. And you know, I think that while we see those geopolitical wranglings, we have to think, well, you know, who will suffer under these conditions? And it's the communities that have historically been disenfranchised or enslaved or exploited in order for capital to be accumulated in other areas and for the world system to, you know, unravel as it has. And so, you know, I mean, maybe this is quite different than addressing the mining industry directly, as Fernando did in responding to the question from Luke. But, you know, I would sort of raise here something that's been on my mind a bit, which is the kind of lens of reparations that has gotten increasing attention, you know, since the murder of George Floyd and, you know, the sudden waking up of the majority of the world to anti-Black racism and just racism in general, that, you know, if we started to think about the long-term impacts of extractivism, and specifically the mining and oil and gas industries through a reparations lens, the way, you know, many countries in the Caribbean have sought to, you know, reframe our understanding of the history of the transatlantic slave trade, you know, using that lens while it is embedded in a capitalist framework and reproduces capitalist logics, it still demonstrates that the future of these industries, you know, if through full cost accounting, could be pretty dim. And so, you know, maybe we need to normalize that way of thinking about these industries, one that kind of centers on full cost accounting and on historical reparations. So, yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Anna, and we'll end with Maiah.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. There's the question of ethics and how do you talk to coworkers and employers about ethics? You know, the question about how to get an employer to treat ethically their employees is, you know, of course, one of the most important questions of all times. And I leave it to labor organizers to continue fighting that fight, often successfully. And you know, but then there's the ethical question with regard to communities. And I think, you know, yeah, companies usually get away with a lot. Terrible practices toward communities, and they usually do get away with it. They don't always, though. And so if I were talking to a supervisor of management at these companies, I would be interested to see how they think about their self-interest in ethical practices and how improvements in ethical practices could help community relations, which could help investment and profits. So that's a couple of questions. There's one more question that's come up about the West Moberly First Nation in Northern BC, and this very interesting note about, you know, the tragedy, the devastation, the loss of land, sovereignty, right to self-determination, only for a small amount of money. You know, a tragic story. And there are many of these tragic stories. My response to that is to study this in a comparative context. You know, kind of what different outcomes do we see out there? Because these outcomes are common, but not the only outcomes. And so to understand under what conditions do you get different outcomes for indigenous tribes, I think could powerfully lead to conclusions about what does lead to effective mobilizing and the protection of indigenous lands and territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Maiah. And I'd like to thank, again, all of the panelists today, Anna Zalik, Jennifer Moore, Fernando Leiva, Maiah Jaskoski. Thank you so much for being a part of our panel discussion today on new company strategies in extractivism in the post-COVID world. Thank you. You can follow the Extractivism and Society Research Cluster in future events. I'll put our new and still under construction website into the chat.